So let me ask you something. What if the historical Jesus, the real person, did things that were so controversial they'd get him completely canceled in our world today? I'm talking deplatformed, protested, the whole thing. By the time we're done here, you might just realize that the figure you thought you knew was actually one of the most dangerous, disruptive people of all time.
All right, let's just dive right in. This is the big question we're really digging into. Would the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth survive our modern cancel culture? I know, it sounds a little wild, but when you look at the record, the answer is, well, it's surprisingly clear.
And just so we're on the same page, we're not even going to get into the miracles or the theology. We're just looking at his actions. Tangible things he did that were documented. Things that absolutely threatened the status quo back then, and would almost certainly do the exact same thing today.
So, where do we start? Well, let's begin with his most direct confrontations, the times he went head-to-head with the established systems of power. This is Exhibit A.
First up on the list of cancelable offenses, how about the violent destruction of a religious business? Seriously, just picture it. It's a totally normal day at the temple, which was the center of everything, right? Religion, the economy, and then, out of nowhere, this carpenter from a small town shows up and just loses it.
The historical account in Matthew 21 is incredibly direct. He didn't just hold up a sign and protest. No, he overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. He literally, physically, shut the whole operation down.
Now, in its original context, this was seen as this righteous act against people who are exploiting faith for money. But can you just imagine the headlines today? Religious extremist destroys local business. He wouldn't be seen as some kind of reformer. He'd be labeled a dangerous vandal, maybe even a terrorist.
All right, next up. An act of verbal disruption that would be absolute career suicide today. He publicly called out and denounced the most respected religious leaders of his time.
And let me tell you, he did not hold back. This quote from Matthew 23, it's one of the most brutal takedowns you'll ever read. "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" I mean, that is not a polite disagreement over coffee.
And here's the crucial part. Jesus wasn't attacking their faith or their religion. He was attacking their hypocrisy. But you know how it is in 2024? All that nuance would be completely lost. The headlines would just scream, "Jesus accused of hate speech," or "Carpenter's anti-religious rant goes viral."
But see, it wasn't just about confronting the powerful. He was maybe even more controversial when he was defending the powerless. This brings us to Exhibit B, how Jesus just completely shattered social norms by siding with society's outcasts.
Get this. He deliberately broke what were, for all intents and purposes, public health and quarantine laws, just to touch someone society had labeled unclean. And we're talking about a man with leprosy, a disease that terrified everybody.
The text is so specific about this. It says Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. In that culture, that was a massive violation. People with leprosy were legally required to scream "unclean" to keep everyone away. Jesus did the exact opposite. He closed the distance. He chose human connection over his own safety. The whole point was choosing compassion over fear, humanity over the rules. But in our post-pandemic world, how do you think that would play out? The narrative would be instant. Jesus endangers public health, Carpenter accused of being anti-science. His incredible act of compassion would be twisted into a reckless act against the community.
And here's another one that would absolutely break the internet. He intervened to stop a mob from carrying out justice on someone caught in a criminal act. This is the famous story of the woman caught in the act of adultery.
So you've got this mob, you've got the religious leaders, they have her dead to rights. The law was on their side, they were ready, and then, with one single line, Jesus just completely dismantles their moral high ground. He says, "Let the person who has never sinned throw the first stone."
His goal was clear: expose their hypocrisy and choose mercy when they wanted condemnation. But the discourse today, it would be brutal. The hashtags would be flying. Jesus defends adulterer, ignores victim. The entire conversation would be about accountability, and his act of mercy would be framed as being weak and soft on crime.
So let's recap. We've seen him disrupt the powerful and defend the outcasts. And this
This is where we get to the absolute heart of the story. We need to look at who was really threatened by all of this.
It's a pretty simple question, right? But the answer tells you everything you need to know. Who were the actual people demanding he be silenced, demanding he be canceled for good?
Well, it wasn't the people you might expect. It wasn't the sinners, the tax collectors he ate dinner with, or the prostitutes he defended. And it sure wasn't the sick and marginalized people like the leper he touched. For them, he wasn't a threat. He was the lifeline. He was the first person to actually see them.
No, the people who wanted him gone, the ones who organized his cancellation and, in the end, his execution, were the religious insiders, the establishment. These were the people who had built an entire system of power and control based on rules and reputation. And his message of radical grace threatened everything they had: their power, their income, their identity. He wasn't just breaking their rules, he was making their rules irrelevant.
And that just lays it all out, doesn't it? They chose rules over relationships. They chose power over people. And that forces every single one of us to ask a really uncomfortable question. If you were faced with that same choice today, which side would you actually be on?
And all of this leads to our final point, because this was never meant to be just a history lesson. It's really a dangerous invitation, a challenge that is just as real and just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago.
Because when you step back and look at all these cancelable actions together, you start to see a really clear pattern. It's a revolutionary message. It's about consistently choosing one thing over another. It's about choosing love over the strict letter of the law, choosing truth over what's popular, choosing the marginalized over the mainstream, and valuing real relationships more than a perfect public image. That was the core of his whole agenda.
And really, that's the bottom line. This idea of a safe, sanitized, comfortable Jesus who never offends anyone, that's a modern invention. The real historical figure was radical, he was disruptive, and he was incredibly dangerous to the powers that be. So the final question isn't really whether he would be canceled today. The real question is, are you ready to follow the one who was?